Okay, I am back with another Mr. Ed book reading, and this time this is the next character that cracks me up. This time this is Mr. Silly by Roger Hargreaves. Well, let's begin. Mr. Silly lives in Nonsense Land, which is a very which is a very funny place to live. You see, in Nonsense Land, everything is as silly as could be. In Nonsense Land, the trees are red and the grass is blue. Isn't that silly? In Nonsense Land, dogs wear hats. And do you know how birds fly in Nonsense Land? No, they don't fly forwards. They fly backwards. It is a very silly place indeed. Which, of course, is why Mr. Silly lives there. Mr. Silly, in fact, lives in quite the silliest looking house that you've ever seen in your whole life. Have you ever seen a sillier looking house than that? Now, this particular story is all about the Nonsense Cup. You see, in Nonsense Land, each year they hold a competition, and the cup is awarded to whoever has the silliest idea of the year. Mr. Silly has never won the cup, but each night lying in his bed, he dreamed about winning it. In order to win the Nonsense Cup, Mr. Silly realized that he would have to think up something remarkably silly. He pondered over the problem one morning at breakfast. Incidentally, you may be interested to know what Mr. Silly was having for breakfast. He was having a cup of coffee, which he put a spoonful of marmalade into. And after that, he had a cornflake sandwich. And to finish, he ate a boiled egg. But being Mr. Silly, he ate the shell as well. Isn't that a silly breakfast? Anyway, this particular breakfast time, Mr. Silly was thinking about how to win the cup. He remembered 2 years ago, the cup was won by Mr. Ridiculous. He won by wallpapering his house. Which sounds very ordinary, but in fact, Mr. Ridiculous had wallpapered the outside of the house. And Mr. Silly remembered last year where Mr. Foolish won the cup. Mr. Foolish, who is a friend of Mr. Silly's, has won the cup by inventing a car. It's quite a normal car, apart from one thing. It has square wheels. Isn't that silly? Mr. Silly thought and thought and thought, but it was no good. He even had another cup of coffee with marmalade, but that didn't help either. So he decided to take a walk. Off he went, leaving his front door open, so that he wouldn't have burglars when he was out. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a chicken wearing Wellington boots and carrying an umbrella. Wouldn't it be silly if you wear Wellington boots and carry an umbrella? He said to the chicken. Meow, said the kitchen, because animals don't make the same noise as they do in your country. On his walk, Mr. Silly met a worm wearing a top hat, monocle, and a silly old-school tie. Wouldn't be silly if you didn't wear a top hat or monocle or an old-school tie, he said to the worm. Quack, quack, said the worm. Next, Mr. Silly met a pig wearing trousers and a bowler hat. Would be silly if he didn't wear trousers and a bowler hat. He asked the pig. Moo, said the pig. Isn't that silly? It was quite the idea of Mr. Silly's walk that he had his idea. It was a beautifully silly idea. Quite the silliest idea he've ever had. He heard that and he bought himself a pot of paint and a paintbrush. That's better. The day of the great awarding of the Nonsense Cup arrived. A huge crowd assembled at the city square to see who was going to win the cup. the king of Nonsense Land, mounted the specially built platform. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the crowd in the city square, "it is my pleasure to award the Nonsense Cup whoever has had the silliest idea of the year." "What is the silliest idea of the year?" continued the king, "is by Mr. Muddle the farmer. He has managed to grow, of all things, a square apple." The crowd clapped as the square apple was held up by Mr. Muddle for everybody to see. He felt sure he was going to win. "However," said the king, and as Mr. Muddle's face fell, "we have had an even sillier idea entered by Mrs. Nincompoop." It was a teapot. Quite the silliest teapot there never had been. The crowd broke into thunderous applause. "I therefore had great pleasure," announced the king, "in presenting a nonsense cup to," just as he looked up and stopped in astonishment. Now in the middle of the city square there is a tree. It's always been there, and it was just this tree that the king was looking in astonishment. "What," he cried, "has happened to that tree?" Everybody turned to look. The tree had green leaves. Bright green leaves. Not red leaves like all the trees in Nonsense, but green. There was an amazed silence. "It was me," piped up Mr. Silly. "I painted all the leaves green last night when you're all asleep." "A green tree?" exclaimed the king. "Who ever heard of a green tree?" "A green tree," shouted the crowd. "How silly!" And they started to applaud. Mr. Silly smiled modestly. The king held up his hands. "I think," he said, "that this is the silliest idea I've ever heard of. And therefore, I award the Nonsense Cup to Mr. What did you say his name again? Oh, all right. To Mr. Silly." The crowd cheered and cheered. Mr. Silly went pink with pride. And a bird, perched high up in the branches of the silly green tree, looked down. "Woof," it said, and then it flew off backwards. What in the actual world? That's the same music from the BBC cartoon. That's the music tuned up and the in D sharp minor. Same with the Mr. Tickle cartoon. Forts of Coke. Fun.